Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I want to talk about the unclean birds of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. And I wanted to address that with regard to the issue of chicken. Is chicken clean or unclean? Why I went from not being sure about the issue to now believing that chicken is clean and now eating and raising chicken. I wanted to address that and my progression on this issue, my progression of thinking on the issue. And in the process, I also wanted to address what I see as a lot of information spread around which is not according to the Torah commands. It's not according to the written text. Ideas on resolving this issue or addressing the issue of chicken, which doesn't actually hearken back to what the command says. And so I wanted to hopefully redirect our view to the issue of the text, to what the text says. And in doing so, I also wanted to address the different birds listed in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, an issue that I've been looking at for years now. And I finally reached the point, I believe, that it's time to share my findings on this issue, and it's time to share my understandings on this issue. So I realize this is going to be a longer video, and for some you may be more interested in certain parts of it than others. So in the description box you can get the different times for the different subjects that I address. So feel free to check that out as appropriate. So to start off with, and I recognize that this is a bit of an aside, but since we're going to be talking about clean and unclean, I wanted to bring up the issue that not all of the dietary laws in the written commands are just about clean and unclean. There are also issues regarding, for example, the fat and the blood. So beef fat or beef tallow, as I would understand it, we are not allowed to eat it, and beef tallow is used in some things, including some medicines. So feel free to check that out. It's easy to get when we're focusing on what the actual text says and focusing on the written commands rather than the traditions or rather than the traditional understanding of kosher. It's easy to just think about the clean and unclean issues, but there is more to it with regard to the commands that are received by Moses from Elohim. So I just wanted to bring that up. Sometimes it's not remembered. Now we can get into the issue of the unclean birds. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I went to this gathering in Texas, and at the gathering, someone brought up the idea that chicken was unclean. And upon hearing this, I had just started getting more serious about studying the Hebrew and looking into what different words meant, what the evidence was for these different words. And around that time, I was at the point where I was open to hearing that, and I wasn't sure what I thought about it. I started looking into it and I started thinking, well, some of these words, the translators don't really appear too confident about what they mean, and this is very easy to see for yourself. You can look into what different scholars say and what the research is on these different words, or you can even just open up two different translations and see that there are differences depending upon which scholar is speaking or writing. And this was an issue that became obvious to me at that time, and I decided that I'm going to look into this issue and it'll probably be resolved fairly quickly, and just in the meantime, since I'm not really sure, I'm going to just stop eating chicken and eggs, and once that issue is resolved, then I'll know what the answer is. But the problem is that it ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would, and part of the reason for that is because of the nature of this list, and I'm going to explain the specifics of that. Going into what Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 say regarding clean and unclean birds, fundamentally there is a way that we are commanded to determine whether a bird is clean or unclean, and that is different from the way that we are commanded regarding beasts, regarding aquatic life or fish, and regarding swarming things or insects and so forth. It is different from these. And with these, the way that we know is that we are given criteria in the commands to know that, for example, with fish, it has fins, and it has scales, therefore it's clean. We're given physical characteristics or anatomical features to know, or we are given certain behaviors and so forth. That's how we know whether the animal is clean or unclean with regard to beasts and aquatic life and swarming things. That's not how it works with birds, or more correctly, flying animals. That's not what the law commands regarding that issue. It is distinct. And what it does instead is tells us which birds are unclean. It gives us the list. It gives us a list of unclean birds, and it gives specific birds that you're not supposed to eat this bird and so forth. And also it tells us a class of birds. So for example, it may say every raven to its type, telling us to not eat, from my understanding, telling us to not eat that general class of bird, any bird that would fall under the raven category. So raven, crow, etc. And in my view, this is the distinction that we need to focus on with regard to the issue of birds, because there are a lot of different strategies that people have tried to adopt instead of actually looking at this from what I would understand it as the obviously textual view. Instead of focusing on identifying these birds and understanding this list, a lot of times what is done is the creation of criteria which are not in the written Torah, ideas which are not actually based on the text. And so that's what I want to try to do, is help us to redirect our focus to the text and to try to figure this issue out based upon the text. So this issue should really be simple enough. It should just be an issue of, say we have a bird and we're trying to decide, is this bird clean or unclean? For example, chicken. Is the chicken clean or unclean? What we should hypothetically be able to do is just go through this list and say, it's not that bird, it's not that bird, and it's not that bird. Okay, if it's not any of these birds in the list, therefore it's clean. Hypothetically, it should be that simple. But the issue is, and this should be readily obvious if we look into the way that different translators treat some of these birds and so forth, just opening up two different translations would readily show us that depending on which translator is speaking or which scholar is speaking, there are different views on these different birds. And so that's kind of the roadblock that I ran into whenever I was thinking about this issue and studying this issue before, was that I knew that this idea of criteria and all of that, that's not what the biblical or the textual way to look at it is. But a lot of these birds are pretty obscure, or at least some of them. Some of them only appear in these lists as far as the biblical mentions are concerned. So we have no context clues for some of them, and some of them, they don't really have a lot of external evidence backing them up. And so this was kind of lingering on my mind for years regarding this issue, and I would start looking at it and think that I found some leads, and then I would get to a point where it was like, I don't know if we can even figure this out. So that's kind of the issue with the clean and unclean birds, is that we're supposed to rely on this list, and that leaves us with trying to figure out the list rather than trying to make up criteria that's outside of the list. So that gets into the issue of different approaches to resolving this, different approaches to trying to understand which birds are clean and which birds are unclean, and this also applies to other issues of the Torah as well. And I wanted to address these different approaches and explain what my thoughts are on it, which ones I think are useful, and some of the flaws that I see, especially in some of them, why I think that they are not actually the right way to go if we're concerned with the text of the commands. So the first thing I wanted to address was the issue of generalizations, and I started to address this already, the idea that we're going to make a generalization regarding all the birds that are clean that we know of, or all the birds that are unclean that we know of, and try to use that generalization to guide us in how we address, for example, the issue of chicken. And this one's a pretty common one, and it's common that we would it's expected that we would just create generalizations about just about everything. That's just a natural human thing to do. And so with regard to these, with regard to clean and unclean, we might want to create generalizations. So the one I've heard probably the most is, you're not supposed to eat scavengers. Problem is that that's not a command that we see in Leviticus 11 or Deuteronomy 14. And in my view, that's something that is not absent because of the lack of vocabulary. There are words that are used elsewhere in the Torah that could have easily described that exact phenomenon, and it does not appear as such in that command. And so that's a problem in my view. That's not a textual approach to the issue if we're creating something that it doesn't say. And the same thing applies for looking at, is it a predator? Does it eat its own waste? Is it engage in cannibalism? What is the anatomy of the digestive system? What is the anatomy of the feet, etc.? All these kinds of things, whether is it sick? Does it eat certain things that we wouldn't eat otherwise, etc.? All these sorts of things, they're not actually a part of the command. And that's the biggest issue that I would take with it. So apparently the way that we're commanded is according to these lists, according to looking at the list and comparing the bird with the list. And so creating these criteria, creating these generalizations that are not a part of the commands, in my view, is a problem. Another generalization that I'd point to is looking at clean birds, known clean birds, and in this case, quail, for example, Old World quail, saying that we know quail is clean, we know Old World quail is clean, and I do believe that the Torah supports that. I think that that is evident because, for one thing, it's not in the list. We have a word for a bird, and it's not in the list of unclean birds. So that's just one part of it, but that's a key part. So we know Old World quail is clean, and Old World quail is similar to chicken. And I definitely agree with that. I have raised both of them personally, I've been around them, and I would observe that, yes, there are a lot of similarities, and I've seen arguments that there are things, bad things, quote unquote, that chicken do that would disqualify the bird from being clean. Quail, they do a lot of the same things. So I don't think there's this big distinction, at least in terms of behavior, that some have argued for. I would even go so far to say that I assume there isn't that personal experience there. But even though there are a lot of similarities, and even though the modern scientific classification puts them together as being similar, I would be somewhat hesitant to just make that generalization and say that that's good enough, because Hebrew may be drawing attention to different aspects or different qualities of the bird than we might. So there are differences in culture and what they draw attention to, and so I would be hesitant to just say, because we think that they're similar, therefore automatically they are according to the text. That is something that I would not have been comfortable with by itself in addressing this issue. So I wanted to bring that up also. Another approach might be to look at some of the early translations, so looking at the Greek or Latin or Aramaic translations and thinking that we're going to fill in any gaps of our knowledge regarding Hebrew by looking at these because, for example, we have better awareness of animal vocabulary for Greek or for Latin than we might for Hebrew. And hypothetically, that logic is sound, but the problem is there are significant flaws with these translations. There are definite problems. It's not any kind of perfect solution to this. They are not entirely literal. They do not agree with each other. And there are significant issues that, and we can readily see with words that we're able to readily define, we can see that there are problems with the translation, and they are not even internally consistent in some cases. So, for example, with Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, the numbers of birds, they do not correspond with the Hebrew. and also the list is out of order relative to even comparing, for example, the Greek Leviticus 11 to the Greek Deuteronomy 14, comparing those to the Hebrew. The birds aren't even in the same order, so it's even hard to know on some of them what bird is supposedly being translated from the Hebrew in that case. And so hypothetically there should be some utility in these early translations, but there are significant problems, and clearly this is not going to be a reasonable way to address this issue. Another approach might be to look at historic understandings or historic practices regarding, with this case, whether or not people ate chicken or did not eat chicken. Now, this is one that I see commonly suggested as far as supposedly being evidence, the idea of, did historic Jewish groups eat chicken and consider it to be clean? It doesn't take much research looking at the Tanakh, in my view, to see the clear problem with that approach, with the approach of just looking at what historic Jewish groups did. We can easily see the Israelites did all kinds of stuff in the Tanakh that was not allowed, and sometimes even acting as if they thought they were doing the right thing. There are a number of times where people clearly presume that they are following the law, and yet we can readily see that the law does not allow whatever behavior they're doing or tells us to do something different. That is readily apparent, and that's even during the time of that historic time, not even talking about more recent things. And so, in my view, to look at what some historic Jewish group did 1,000 years ago or something like that, or even 2,000 years ago, I don't think that that carries much weight, if any. I think that that could easily be susceptible to people doing the wrong thing or not caring or not even being aware of the command. So I definitely would suggest not using that as any kind of evidence. Now, that being said, historic understandings, I think that's a different issue. If there's a historic understanding regarding some specific issue, regarding some specific command, or even better, a specific word. For example, if there's evidence regarding the historic understanding of a certain Hebrew word in the bird's list is this bird, I would consider that to be of much more value. I would not consider historic practice to be of much value at all, but historic understandings, I think that is useful, and that is something that I looked into in my research. Looking into etymologies is another common approach. The idea that we would look at, for example, the name of a bird, and then try to compare it with the possible origin of that word, looking at possible other words that could be connected to it, and then using that information to deduce what the bird is. Hypothetically, that should be useful, but if you have looked into etymologies in any language at all, you are aware that sometimes these connections between a word and its origin, sometimes these connections are not very obvious. Sometimes they're pretty strange in reality. And so whenever we're dealing with a bird that maybe the etymology of the bird is to breathe or to vomit, there are a lot of birds that could be referred to using either of those words. So, and that's assuming that that is the true etymology. So there are obviously issues with this. In my view, it's kind of a flawed approach. That's not to say we couldn't derive information from it, and that's not to say that it's without use, because I think there is some information we could get out of it, but at the same time it's highly susceptible to confirmation bias. It's highly susceptible to just working in whatever understanding into the supposed origin of the word that is fitting to our hypothesis. It's very easy to do that with this kind of evidence. So that's not to say it's not useful, but I would not rely on that independently of other evidence. Context clues. I am a big proponent of the use of context clues in studying a word used in the Torah. So the idea would be that we would look at all the different times that a word is used in the Tanakh, and then we would deduce parts of the meaning from it based upon how the word is used. And in the case of birds, maybe we could glean some information specifically about the bird just based on how it's described, based on words that might be used alongside it, etc. The problem is that at least for a number of these birds, the only time that they're mentioned is in the list. We don't have any context clues to use in reference to them. So we don't have information about the things that they do, different aspects of their appearance, and so forth. We don't have that for a lot of them. But for some of them, we may have tiny little bits of information here and there. For example, Qa'ath. It is one of the unclean birds, and it is said to be a resident of the desert. Now, I would consider that to be useful information, but some have contended that maybe we shouldn't use that information because it's from the latter parts of the Tanakh. The thing that I would say is that while I do recognize that there are some theological issues with certain parts of the latter parts of the Tanakh, I do agree with that. I would say there is a difference between saying something is a tool for the language, a tool for understanding a word, versus saying that it is the word of Elohim. I would say there's a difference there, and I would say that we should take any information that we can get that appears to be useful, regardless of whether it's supposed to be actually scripture, regardless of whether it's theologically correct, or etc. If it's a tool that can be used to help understand the language, I think it's something that we should at least consider. So with context clues, there are some examples. I do think it's useful to use. It's just that it's not a perfect solution because a lot of them aren't mentioned outside of the list. Finally, I wanted to discuss the use of different languages, especially different Semitic languages. So the idea would be that, say there's a given Hebrew word, and in this case we're talking about, say, unclean birds. Say there's a name of a bird in Hebrew, and maybe in another related language, another Semitic language, there's another word that appears very similar. And there's the possibility that either one of them is a loan word from that language, or maybe they both share a similar origin to one another. And so maybe there's some information we can glean from that. If they are apparently both the same thing, at least in terms of general category like bird, if they appear to both be referring to birds, and the evidence that we have otherwise appears to line up with it, then maybe we can use this as a source for more information. Maybe we can use this for example, more context clues if that word is used more often in the text that we have from that language. Now, clearly this is not without its flaws, because the exact line of defining reasonable from unreasonable is sometimes hard to tell, and sometimes there are words that they'll appear to be similar to another word in another language, and they're not actually the same, they're not actually of the same origin, they may be just completely different, or even in the case that maybe it did have a similar origin, the meaning can deviate over time, etc. So it's certainly not perfect, but I think it is kind of unfairly criticized because this is in fact a method that many people use in order to look at comparing these different languages and learning the meaning of different words that we don't have a lot of evidence for, especially with regard to understanding things that are said in the Torah. This is something that is commonly done, at least to some degree. So I think it could be used, and I think it could be a source of useful information, so long as it is balanced against whatever other information we have, checking to see whether or not it lines up with historic understandings and context clues that we already have in the Hebrew, etc. So I think this is something that is definitely worth looking at, and it is something that I looked at also, comparing a given Hebrew word with other similar languages or other related languages, and seeing what else could be found in that other language. So these are some of the approaches that one might use in looking at the list of unclean birds. I wanted to mention these and some of the ways that I addressed it, and also some of the flaws that I saw with addressing it in particular ways. So I wanted to make that clear before proceeding into the actual list. So now getting into the actual unclean birds lists that appear in Leviticus 11 verses 13 through 19 and Deuteronomy 14 verses 12 through 18. There are 20 birds listed in Leviticus 11. In Deuteronomy 14 there are 2 additional birds listed. And I wanted to mention that in looking at the different Hebrew manuscripts that I had access to and looking at the Samaritan Pentateuch and otherwise, I did not see any significant differences. I did not see anything of note. From what I can tell and from what I could see, they're more or less consistent across these different manuscripts. I'm going to go through the list in Leviticus 11. I'm going to give my research, my thoughts on each individual bird, and then I'm going to add the 2 additional birds from Deuteronomy 14 at the end. So here's my research on the individual birds. First is Nesher. This is commonly treated as eagle and is referenced frequently in the text. However, in my research, eagle does not appear to be correct. Most Hebrew scholars now appear to favor griffon vulture as the bird being referred to. Some suggest the word could also refer to vultures in general, so it could be used either in a specific or a general sense, but if it's referring to a specific bird, griffon vulture is likely the bird in question. And this also seems to fit well with the context that we have. Now, some people might object for cultural reasons to Exodus 19:4, which would then say, "I bore you on wings of vultures, and I brought you to me." But we have to keep in mind that our modern cultural perspective on a bird may not match what other cultures' perspectives on the bird have been. Griffon vulture, or possibly vulture in general, does seem to fit well. Second is Peres. This one is almost universally agreed to be the bearded vulture. The meaning of the word does seem to have been carried down with the use of the language. Also, this name does seem to have an etymology that fits with the identification of bearded vulture. Third is Azniyah. Most agree that it is a type of eagle or vulture, or possibly a general class of both of them. Most of the modern scholarship in my research suggested that the bird is the cinereous vulture, otherwise referred to as the black vulture. One argument is that it is etymologically connected with the 2 birds that follow it, and one of the names unique to the Deuteronomy list, those being Da'ah, Ayah, and Dayah, which from what I can tell are types of kites and or buzzards. This connection is not certain, but it does seem like a possibility. In addition to that, the first part of the word, Oz, is suggested to refer to its black or dark color. Verse 14 starts with Da'ah. Many suggest that these similar sounding birds, which also appear in the lists, Da'ah, Ra'ah, Ayah, Dayah, all belong to the same general class of bird, that they are all types of kites and or buzzards, and this seems to be supported by the evidence. We do have evidence from traditional understandings of the words and from similar words in related languages. This does appear to be a type of kite. Next is Ayah. Much of what I said about the previous bird still applies. It is likely buzzard or kite, or possibly a falcon or a similar bird. More specifically, it could either be the black kite or the honey buzzard, which bear similarities to each other in their appearance. And following this bird, we are told to its type. So I would infer that this bird and its class of birds are forbidden, and that may also include some of the birds listed before it. Leviticus 11:15 has Orev. This is almost universally understood to be the raven and raven type. This is backed up by a large amount of evidence, and there doesn't seem to be any question about it. I will point out that it says every raven to its type, so it's clear that this is more than one isolated species of bird. Crows, magpies, and those sorts of birds would probably fall under this command also in my view. Leviticus 11:16 starts with Bath ha-ya'anah. This is an unusual name compared with the other birds in the list because instead of just being a single word, it is a phrase that begins with daughter of. This has led to some people to debate that maybe only the female of the species is unclean, whereas the male is clean. In my assessment, that is not what is being referred to. To me, this phrase appears to be the name of the bird rather than literally referring to the daughter of a bird. Literally, I would understand it to mean daughter of the desert or something similar to that, and I would take that phrase as the name of a species of bird. This is supported by some other researchers on the issue, and while they're not identical, we do see similar phrases which are used as names in other Semitic languages. As to what the bird is, ostrich seems to be a common understanding for it, and that does seem reasonable. The word yaen, which could easily be connected to this phrase, refers to the ostrich. The other possibility is a type of owl. This is suggested by some scholars, and maybe it is possible, but in my view it doesn't have as much pointing to it as ostrich does. Next is Tachmas. There are a few different suggestions on this one. I am inclined toward nightjar, which is supported by some traditions and possibly by the Tunisian word thama. Alternate suggestions include falcon or kestrel. This is a minority view, but in support of this, the word could be connected with the Arabic thahemas. Some others suggest owls, such as the Scopes owl or barn owl. Obviously, there is some disagreement on this one, and I wouldn't necessarily rule out any of these suggestions, but my inclination is toward nightjar. Next is Shachaph. This is near universally understood to refer to gulls and terns. There isn't much in terms of context clues or linguistic evidence for it, but there is near universal agreement on it in terms of tradition, modern understanding, and early translations. The only noteworthy alternative I noticed was the suggestion by Yisrael Aharoni of tawny owl, and he connected it with the Arabic word hufas, suggesting a metathesis with the Hebrew word, the switching of the sounds in the word when going from the one language to the other. There is a pattern of this going on when comparing the languages, so it is possible, but I will point out that Aharoni had the hypothesis that many of these birds are owls, and his views seem to be that all of the owls that lived in the Canaan area were referred to in the Tanakh at some point. With a lot of the assertions that he made regarding the birds, at least from what I've seen, he often did not provide much basis for his claims, and so it makes me wonder about whether his idea about the owls in the text could have become too important in a sense, and maybe that led to some confirmation bias. I don't know that, and he probably didn't always explain his basis for everything, and it's possible he was right. But I am inclined to be cautious when I see either no evidence or little evidence being provided for a claim, while the hypothesis is made very prominent. In this case, he did provide an argument and a basis for his claim, but I just wanted to make that context clear because the assertion of tawny owl is an outlier. Gull or tern is nearly universally accepted. Next is nets. This one is confidently some type of hawk, sparrowhawk, or similar small raptor. This is supported by traditional understanding and is also suggested by similar or identical words in related languages. The verse also refers to its kind, presumably including the general class of hawk. In Leviticus 11:17 we have kos. This is near universally understood as an owl, and typically is considered the little owl. This is also backed up by some evidence from related languages. Next is Shalakh. Almost everyone asserts that this is a type of fishing bird. This seems to be based on the tradition for the bird and also the etymology which is understood from the bird name. However, there are a number of suggestions for what fishing bird that could refer to. Some of the more modern researchers argue in favor of fish owl. Common suggestions include cormorant or osprey, and some other suggestions include sea raven, pelican, and heron. I would not confidently choose any particular assertion over another on this one, but I will point out that it is basically universally accepted as a fishing bird. Next is Yanshuph. This is commonly considered to be an owl, either the eagle owl or an eared owl. From what I can tell, owl does seem to be backed up by a similar word in a related language. And like a number of the other birds, having that agreement between a historic understanding and possible linguistic evidence does encourage confidence for that interpretation. I will mention that there are some other suggestions, although they do not appear to have much evidence for them, and those include bee-eater and ibis. Moving on to Leviticus 11:18, we have Tinshemeth. This bird is commonly understood to be the barn owl. There are arguments made from its presumed etymology for breathing or snoring. While in my view that evidence is not particularly strong, it is a widespread tradition that the bird is the barn owl or screech owl. While in the minority, there are some other suggestions made. The early translations seem to suggest purple gallinule or swan. It's worth noting that it has the same name as a swarming thing, which is referred to at the end of Leviticus 11:30, so some have suggested maybe it could refer to a bat. In a similar vein, the Samaritan tradition on this apparently goes so far to claim that the animal simply is a rodent or similar vermin. While maybe it could be a bat, the idea that it would be some kind of rodent or other vermin which burrows into the ground goes against the framing of the text and is not reasonable in my view. Such an animal would not either be a bird or flying thing at all. Another suggestion was the buzzard, but it was an isolated one and there was no reasoning provided for it. I read one source claim that the Samaritan tradition is that this bird is a guinea fowl. When I tried to research that claim, I found nothing to back it up, and this seemed to be disconfirmed by the Samaritans themselves. So considering the widespread tradition and the etymological argument seems to favor barn owl, and considering the other claims are isolated and seem to either be unreasonable or without evidence, I am inclined to think barn owl seems most likely. Next is Qa'ath. A translation of pelican has been suggested and is one of the traditional translations for this bird, but that does not appear to fit with the context clues that we have. This is one of the few birds that we actually have a number of references for outside of the list itself, and this bird is described as an inhabitant of dry, desert, barren wastes. One research tried to rebut this point by saying that it refers to the bird as a resident of the wilderness, and that wilderness is not necessarily desert. But if you look at the verses surrounding that context, surrounding that reference, it is made clear that it is talking about a place that is indeed dry and desolate. So in my view, pelican would not fit. What seems much more likely to me is that it is some type of owl, which is the other common proposal for the bird. This could be the desert little owl, or possibly the Scopes owl or another owl. In favor of this, there is a word in a related language that may be connected to it, which also refers to a type of owl. Next is Racham. This bird is almost certainly the white scavenger vulture, also known as the Egyptian vulture or gear eagle. Not only is it a widespread tradition, but it is supported by an identical word appearing in a related language. In Leviticus 11:19, we have Chasidah. This is commonly accepted as the stork or white stork, and this does appear to be supported by the evidence. There are context clues which fit with stork, and also it appears that ancient Greek may have taken the Hebrew word and brought it in as a loan word, Azniyah, into their language, also referring to stork. Next is Anaphah. The near universal understanding is that this bird is a heron or similar bird. My view is that it likely refers to the heron, and this may include, in the general category, which is also forbidden, the spoonbill and flamingo. One reason I say that is that a similar word in a related language also appears to refer to the flamingo. Next is Dukifath. From what I can tell, the translation of hupo is well supported by evidence in Hebrew, other languages, and early traditions. It is widely accepted, though there are some alternative suggestions. Some argue for lapwing. Rashi supposedly suggested a bird called a wild peacock, a phrase used to describe the lapwing according to Pierre Bellon, who described the lapwing as hoopoe-like. Elsewhere, Rashi suggests hoopoe. Also, the bird was translated into Aramaic as something like mountain woodpecker or wild rooster, which seemingly led some people to suspect it might be a type of pheasant, but the Aramaic translations have supposedly been shown to refer to hoopoe. So I will point out that this is the only bird that I've seen any sort of argument with any sort of stated basis to claim that it might be a bird similar to chicken, but those arguments appear to be debunked. And apart from that, there is evidence and acceptance for hoopoe. The last one in Leviticus is Atalef. There isn't a lot of evidence provided for it, but it is near universally accepted to be the bat. Now, switching to Deuteronomy 14, verse 13, which appears instead of the two kites which are mentioned in Leviticus 11:14. First is Ra'ah. The most common suggestion appears to be red kite. Other suggestions include other types of kites or similar birds. It makes sense that if this is going to replace one of the words for kite in Leviticus 11, then it would also refer to a kite. The next bird in Deuteronomy 14:13 is also listed in Leviticus 11:14, which refers to a buzzard or kite, as discussed previously. Finally, the last bird is Ayah. This likely refers to the black kite, or otherwise another type of kite or buzzard. It may generally refer to a class of birds which would include kites and buzzards. This seems well supported by the evidence, including early translations, traditions, and a similar word in a related language. Those are the 22 birds listed. As a summary, this is how I would translate the list. And these you shall treat as repulsive from the flying animal. They shall not be eaten. They are repulsive. The griffon vulture, and the bearded vulture, and the cinereous vulture, and the kite, and the buzzard, alternate, black kite, to its kind. Every raven to its kind. And the ostrich, alternate, owl. And the nightjar, alternate, falcon, owl. And the gull, alternate, tawny owl. And the hawk to its kind. And the little owl, and the fish owl, alternate, osprey, cormorant, pelican, or sea raven. And the eagle owl, alternate, eared owl. And the barn owl and the desert little owl, alternate, scopes owl. And the white scavenger vulture. And the stork, the heron, alternate, spoonbill, flamingo, to its kind. And the hoopoe and the bat. And then in Deuteronomy, and the red kite, and the buzzard, and the black kite to its kind. Those are the birds listed as unclean in the text, and that's the summary of my research regarding each individual bird and regarding the list. So now I wanted to give some general thoughts and conclusions as a result of that research. As I alluded to, whenever I first started studying this issue of the unclean birds, I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to look at each individual bird in the list, and I was going to study each individual word and find out which bird is being referred to with each word. And once I had a conclusive translation for every single bird, in that situation I would have the answer as to whether chicken was clean or chicken was unclean, because if it wasn't in the list, then it wasn't an unclean bird, therefore it's a clean bird. So that was my approach initially, but I kept running into what I would perceive as obstacles or roadblocks, that I would run out of ideas on where to look or what to research, and I just wouldn't have answers that I wanted. I wouldn't know where to look, and so years passed by at times, and then I would have an idea that, well, I'm going to research this or research this angle, and I kept coming up with more evidence eventually, but at one point about a year ago I felt like I really had run out of ideas on research, that even though I had like a confident translation for almost all of the birds, there were still about 4 or 5 that I wasn't sure on, that I wasn't entirely satisfied with what I had on them. One example would be Tinshemeth. I wasn't entirely sure on what bird to identify it as. And so I was pretty frustrated with that, and eventually I had kind of a mindset shift. My thinking was that I have the evidence that I have, and all of the words that I'm aware of from around that time period that may have referred to chicken, none of them appear in the list. And even if I'm not 100% sure on each of these 5 birds, that generally speaking the evidence either pointed toward a specific class of birds, or there was agreement that it was either one or another bird. And looking at all of that, and looking at the fact that I couldn't see any actual legitimate argument that was posed by anyone that suggested that chicken was unclean, or that suggested that chicken was one of the birds in the list, looking at all of that, I felt like there wasn't the evidence to support chicken being viewed as unclean. In fact, the evidence pointed the other direction, that even if there wasn't this entire agreement, that the agreement was that it wasn't chicken. And so after thinking about it in that way, and after recognizing that maybe I wasn't 100% confident on some of these birds, that the evidence pointed away from chicken, that the evidence supported that it was something else other than chicken. And so that's when I arrived at the decision that I would believe or recognize chicken as clean, and that I did not believe there is any evidence to support that chicken is unclean. So this puts me in a similar line of thinking as to some other people on this subject, in that I do accept that we don't know with 100% certainty what each individual bird in this list is, and it may truly not be possible to know the exact species at this time. But that being said, we do know, in a lot of cases, we do know the general category of what the bird likely is. So, for example, we do know that certain words, they refer to a type of owl, but we may not know exactly what owl. Or certain birds appear to refer to a type of kite, but we may not know exactly what type of kite. So I'm not suggesting that we are making up generalizations or anything like that, that we're making up categories that are not in the text. I'm not saying therefore all predators are prohibited, or therefore all scavengers are prohibited. But what I'm suggesting is that using the evidence that we have, we can see that even if there's a disagreement on exactly what kite or exactly what buzzard is being referred to, that we have a general idea that it's a type of kite, it's a type of buzzard, etc. And we can use that, practically speaking, in choosing what we're going to eat, what we're not going to eat. And so the way I would look at it now is to look at the list and look at the information that we have, or at least the information that I have regarding the list, and use that to determine whether a bird is clean or unclean, or whether a bird could be unclean based upon maybe there's a slight discrepancy, or maybe there's a question as to the exact identification. I would use that evidence that I had in making that assessment. And once again, I do not see any evidence to suggest that chicken would be unclean. Therefore, in applying that evidence, applying the list does not appear to prohibit it. So I wanted to address the issue of the unclean birds, the issue of chicken, and also these different strategies at looking at the text. And I wanted to redirect us to what the text says. I wanted to redirect our focus to looking at the written commands, to looking at how we are commanded to approach these different issues, and to work within the actual text of the command in understanding it.